I was trying on shoes when the salesman got a little too close. What happens when a simple shopping trip turns into a dangerous temptation? When my fingers brushed against his, I knew I had already gone too far. But the real question is, how far was I willing to go? Was this just an innocent moment, or the beginning of something I could never take back? Before we dive into this unforgettable story, make sure to subscribe to my channel for more captivating real-life tales like this one. And don't forget to leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from today. Now, let's begin. I had no intention of flirting with the man who was about to slide a shoe onto my foot. It was just a routine errand, nothing more than an afternoon indulgence in retail therapy to break up the monotony of my lonely days. My husband David was out of town on business again. The house had felt unbearably empty, and the silence pressed against my chest like a weight. I needed to get out. That's how I found myself wandering into the Luxe Boutique, a high-end shoe store nestled between an artisan bakery and a designer clothing shop. It was the kind of place where the scent of leather mingled with expensive perfume, where the shoes gleamed under soft golden lighting, practically begging to be touched. I ran my fingers over a pair of nude stilettos, the delicate straps whispering promises of elegance. My heart wasn't in it, though. My mind was elsewhere, on the disconnect between David and me, on the way our conversations had turned into brief exchanges of logistics rather than affection. "Can I help you with something?" The voice was smooth, velvety, and startlingly close. I turned, and there he was. The salesman. The first touch. He was tall, lean, and effortlessly confident. Dark curls framed a chiseled jawline, his piercing blue eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my stomach flutter. My voice faltered as I caught my breath. I was just looking for Swedish. "Well," he said, stepping forward with an easy smirk. "Then let's make sure you find something worth looking at." His name tag read Liam, simple, direct. Something about the way he looked at me, like I was worth more than just another passing customer, made my skin tingle. It had been so long since I'd felt noticed. He crouched down gracefully, plucking the stiletto I'd been eyeing from the shelf. "May I?" he asked, already reaching for my foot. I hesitated. The intimacy of it was sudden, unexpected, but I nodded. As his fingers wrapped around my ankle, a shiver traveled up my leg. His touch was warm, steady, deliberate. He slid the shoe onto my foot with a precision that felt almost reverent. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "Perfect fit," he murmured, his fingers lingering for just a second too long. My throat was dry. "They're beautiful. So are you." I looked up sharply, but his face remained unreadable. Just the hint of a smirk playing on his lips. Had I imagined it? The air felt charged between us, thick with something unspoken. I knew I should stand up, step away, pretend this was nothing more than customer service. But instead I watched him, waiting, unsure if I wanted him to break the moment or make it last just a little longer. A sudden rush of heat. I pulled my foot back, standing quickly to shake off the sensation. "I'll take them," I said too fast. His smirk widened, as if he knew exactly what was happening inside me. "Great choice. Let me ring you up." I followed him to the register, my pulse quickening with every step. As he handed me the bag, our fingers brushed. Just barely, but it was enough. Enough to leave an imprint. Enough to make my body betray me with a slow, creeping warmth that spread through my chest. "Enjoy them," Liam said, his voice lower, just for me. I swallowed hard. "Thank you." Then, as if running from something I didn't dare acknowledge, I turned and walked out of the store. Lingering thoughts. That night I stood in my bedroom, staring at the shoebox. I should have put them in the closet, forgotten about them until the next formal event. Instead, I lifted the lid, ran my fingers over the sleek leather, and felt an odd, unwelcome ache settle in my chest. David had texted me earlier, short and personal, late meeting, don't wait up. I slipped the stiletto onto my foot. My breath hitched. I thought of Liam, of his hands, of the way he looked at me like I was something worth looking at. And then, before I could stop myself, I whispered his name, returning to the scene. 2 days later, I was back at the Luxe Boutique. I told myself it was logical. The shoes pinched slightly. I needed a half size bigger. It was a completely innocent reason to return. Except it wasn't. Because the moment I stepped inside, my stomach clenched in anticipation. My eyes scanned for him before I could help myself. And then there he was, leaning against the counter, looking up as if he had been expecting me. "Didn't think I'd see you so soon," Liam said, his smirk deepening. I swallowed. The fit wasn't quite right. "Or maybe," he murmured, stepping around the counter, "you just needed another excuse to see me." I laughed, breathless. "You're awfully sure of yourself." His gaze flicked down to my feet. "And yet here you are." I was playing with fire. I knew it. But for the first time in years, I wanted to burn. A dangerous invitation. Liam led me to the plush fitting area where soft chairs and full-length mirrors surrounded us. He knelt once again, effortlessly pulling off my shoe. This time his fingers didn't just brush against my ankle. They lingered. My heart pounded. "Let's try these," he said, selecting a different pair. He slipped one on, then the other. His hands traced the curve of my foot, sliding up just an inch too high, fingertips grazing my calf. I should have pulled away, but I didn't. When he looked up at me, the question was there in his eyes. This time I had no answer. My breath hitched. I wasn't just trying on shoes anymore. I was trying on something far more dangerous, something I might never be able to take off. Liam's fingers lingered just a second too long against my calf, his gaze steady as he knelt before me. My pulse thundered in my ears, my breath coming just a little too fast. This wasn't normal. This wasn't customer service. It was something else entirely. Something that had me swallowing hard as heat crept up my neck. I shifted in my seat, pretending to examine the shoes he had slipped onto my feet, but my focus was fractured, my thoughts tangled in the sensation of his touch. His hands were still on me, steady, sure, fingertips pressing into my skin with just enough pressure to make me hyper-aware of every nerve in my body. I told myself to stand up, to break the moment, but my body betrayed me, staying still, savoring the stolen intimacy of his hands against me. I didn't want to leave. I didn't want him to stop touching me. Liam exhaled, the warmth of his breath barely brushing my knee, his smirk shifting into something softer, something unreadable. "You okay?" His voice was low, knowing, teasing the space between us. I nodded too quickly, my voice catching in my throat before I found my words. "Yes, just these feel nice." It was a ridiculous thing to say given the tension hanging between us, but he let it slide, his fingers tracing back down my calf before finally releasing me. I exhaled, forcing a smile as I stood, my legs unsteady beneath me. Liam remained kneeling for a moment longer, watching me. Something flickering behind his eyes, something that told me he was testing me, waiting to see if I would push away or pull closer. I should have stepped back. Instead, I stood there, holding his gaze, letting the heat coil between us. He straightened slowly, his body impossibly close to mine, and my breath caught as the space between us shrank into nothing. The air was thick, suffocating in the most intoxicating way. I could smell his cologne, the faintest trace of cedar, and something warm, something distinctly him. I didn't know what was happening, only that I wanted it to. My hands twitched at my sides, aching to reach out, to brush against the crisp fabric of his shirt, to close the gap. His lips parted slightly, his breath uneven, and I knew if I leaned in, even just an inch, I'd feel them against my own. A chime rang from the front of the store, breaking whatever spell had settled over us. I jerked back, pulse racing, as a woman walked in, completely oblivious to what she had interrupted. Liam smirked, a knowing gleam in his eyes, and stepped away, his hands sliding into his pockets. "Looks like we'll have to finish this later," he murmured, just loud enough for me to hear. My stomach flipped, my body humming with the promise in his words. I left the store in a daze, my thoughts a jumbled mess of guilt and want. My fingers clutched the shopping bag like it could tether me back to reality, but nothing felt real anymore. I had just flirted with a man who wasn't my husband. Worse, I had wanted it. I had craved it. The way Liam looked at me, the way his hands felt against my skin. It was a kind of attention I hadn't had in years, and now that I had tasted it, I wasn't sure I could go without it. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, David's slow, rhythmic breathing beside me. I turned my head, studying his face, the man I had built a life with. He was handsome, dependable, a good man, but I couldn't remember the last time he had looked at me the way Liam had. I shifted, my body restless, memories of the day replaying over and over in my mind, my skin tingling where Liam had touched me. I closed my eyes, but instead of sleep, I fell into a restless haze of heated glances and the phantom weight of Liam's hands. Days passed, and I told myself I wouldn't go back. I told myself it had been nothing, a fleeting moment of indulgence, a harmless thrill. But every time my phone buzzed, I hoped it was him. Every time I walked past the boutique, my steps slowed, my pulse quickening with the possibility of seeing him again. I was unraveling, and I knew it, and yet I didn't stop myself. A week later, I found myself standing outside the Luxe boutique again, my stomach a twisted mess of anticipation and guilt. I told myself I had a reason this time, the shoes I had bought, my excuse to be here, sat in a bag at my side. They pinched just slightly at my toes. It was practical to exchange them, to come back. And yet, as I stepped through the doors, I knew practicality had nothing to do with it. Liam was behind the counter, his eyes flicking up the second I entered. A slow smile spread across his lips, something knowing, something that sent a jolt straight to my core. "Couldn't stay away?" he asked, his voice laced with amusement. I forced a breathy laugh, holding up the bag as my shield. They didn't fit quite right. It was the truth, but we both knew that wasn't why I was here. He motioned for me to follow him back to the fitting area, the same place where everything had shifted between us. I swallowed hard, my heart slamming against my ribs as I sat down. He knelt before me again, his hands gentle as he slid the shoes from my feet, his touch deliberate, lingering. "Let's try something different," he murmured, reaching for another pair. His fingers brushed against my ankle as he guided my foot into the new shoe, his touch sending a ripple of heat through me. I knew this was wrong. I knew I should stand up and walk away, but I didn't. I stayed, letting his hands skim my skin, letting the warmth of his breath fan over my knee. He was testing me again, pushing the boundaries, and I was letting him. I exhaled shakily, my eyes meeting his, and for a moment I forgot where I was. I forgot about David. I forgot about consequences. All I knew was the way Liam looked at me, the way his hands felt against my skin, the way my body responded to him with a hunger I hadn't felt in years. His fingers trailed up my calf, his touch feather-light, teasing, daring. My breath hitched, my stomach tightening, and I knew I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't undo. "You should probably stop," I whispered, though there was no conviction behind my words. He smirked, his thumb pressing into my skin, his touch searing. "Do you really want me to?" I didn't answer. I couldn't, because the truth was, I didn't want him to stop. Liam's hand slid higher, his fingertips grazing the sensitive skin above my knee, and I let out a soft, shuddering breath. His touch was electric, setting my nerves ablaze, and I knew in that moment that I was lost. He leaned in, his lips a breath away from mine, his eyes dark with something dangerous, something thrilling. "Say the word," he murmured, his voice rough with restraint. The door chime rang again, and I jerked back, my heart slamming against my ribs. Liam exhaled sharply, pulling his hands away, his expression shifting back to something composed, unreadable. I stumbled to my feet, my face burning, my hands trembling as I clutched the bag against my chest. I needed to leave. I needed to put distance between us before I did something I couldn't take back. Liam watched me, his gaze steady, knowing. "This isn't over," he said, his voice a quiet promise. I swallowed hard, turning toward the door, my pulse roaring in my ears. I didn't know if I wanted him to be right. I didn't know if I wanted this to be over or if I wanted to fall deeper, to let myself drown in the fire he had ignited inside me. All I knew was that I would be back, and next time I wouldn't stop him. Liam's voice echoed in my head long after I left the boutique. "This isn't over." I tried to tell myself it was. Tried to believe that I could walk away and forget the way his touch had seared into my skin. But I couldn't. That night, as I lay in bed beside David, my body was restless, my mind trapped in a loop of memories I shouldn't have allowed to form. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to focus on my husband, on the man I had pledged my life to. But no matter how hard I tried, it was Liam's hands I felt, his breath I imagined skimming my lips, his whispered words tightening around me like a noose. Days passed, and I told myself to stay away, to let it go. But the fire had already been lit, and no amount of logic could douse it. Every time I passed the boutique, my pulse quickened, my feet hesitating just long enough to remind me that I was one weak moment away from surrendering. I went through the motions at home, pretending everything was normal, pretending I wasn't coming undone from the inside out. David barely noticed. He was busy, as always, wrapped up in meetings, conference calls, and late nights at the office. When he did look at me, it was with the same casual affection he had always given, nothing more, nothing less. But I was changing. I could feel it. One evening, as I stood at the kitchen counter slicing vegetables for dinner, my phone vibrated against the marble. My hands stilled, my breath catching in my throat as I glanced at the screen, a number I didn't recognize. But I knew. My fingers trembled as I swiped the message open. "Miss me?" Just 2 words, but they sent a bolt of heat straight through me. I hesitated, my heart hammering, my rational mind screaming at me to delete the message, to forget him. Instead, I typed back a single word. "Yes." The next day, I walked into the Luxe boutique like a woman possessed. I wasn't returning shoes this time. I wasn't pretending to be here for anything other than what I wanted, what I needed. Liam saw me the moment I stepped inside, his smirk curling at the edges as he leaned against the counter, arms crossed. The store was empty, save for a few displays of glossy heels and polished leather boots, but none of it mattered. The only thing I saw was him. He didn't speak right away, didn't need to. The silence between us crackled, thick with something undeniable. "I was starting to think you weren't coming back," he finally murmured, his voice smooth, teasing. I swallowed hard, taking a step closer, then another, until the scent of him wrapped around me, intoxicating and dangerous. I told myself I wouldn't. I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Liam tilted his head, studying me like I was something he had been waiting to unravel. "But you did," he said, reaching out, his fingers grazing my wrist, sending a shiver straight through me. "Then it matters." I should have pulled away. I should have told him this was a mistake. Instead, I let him guide me toward the back of the store, past racks of designer shoes and velvet-lined benches, until we reached the small fitting room tucked in the farthest corner. He pushed the curtain aside, motioning for me to step inside. My pulse thundered as I hesitated, the weight of my choices pressing against my chest. But when I looked into his eyes, all I saw was a promise of something I had been craving for far too long. Without another thought, I stepped inside, and the curtain fell closed behind me. The moment we were alone, Liam's hands were on me, his grip firm, possessive, pulling me flush against him. My breath hitched as his fingers traced down my arms, his touch igniting something deep in my core. "Tell me to stop," he murmured, his lips brushing against my ear, his voice laced with restraint. But I didn't. I couldn't. My hands fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer, answering the question he hadn't needed to ask. Liam's mouth found mine and the world tilted. His kiss was nothing like I had known before. Hungry, demanding, filled with a fire that consumed every rational thought in my head. I melted into him, into the heat, into the way his hands roamed my body like he had been waiting his whole life to touch me. My back hit the fitting room wall, my breath coming in ragged gasps as his lips traced down my neck, his hands sliding over my waist, pulling me closer, deeper into something I knew I wouldn't be able to escape. I lost track of time in that small hidden space. There was only Liam, his touch, his breath, the way he made me feel like I was the only woman in the world. When we finally pulled apart, my lips were swollen, my body humming with the remnants of what we had done. Liam's thumb traced along my jaw, his gaze dark, unreadable. "You're incredible," he murmured, his voice rough with something I didn't dare name. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath, trying to ignore the way my heart clenched at his words. I stepped out of the fitting room minutes later, my legs still weak, my hands shaking. The store was still empty, but the world outside had changed. I had changed. Liam leaned against the counter watching me, a smirk playing at his lips. "See you soon?" he asked, knowing the answer before I even said it. I hesitated for only a second before nodding, my pulse thrumming with anticipation. Yes. That night, I barely spoke to David. I went through the motions, setting the table, eating dinner, pretending everything was normal. But I wasn't the same. I had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Liam, felt his hands, heard his voice whispering against my skin. I told myself it was just once, that I had gotten it out of my system, but deep down, I knew the truth. Days passed, and I found myself making excuses to see him again. A new pair of heels, a belt that I didn't need. Each time Liam was there waiting, his touch sending fire through my veins. It became our game. These stolen moments, this dangerous dance. We were reckless, insatiable, caught in a web of desire that neither of us wanted to untangle. He would pull me into the fitting room, his hands on me before the curtain even closed. I would lose myself in him, forgetting who I was, forgetting the world outside. I started lying to David more than I ever had before. Little things at first. An afternoon out, a coffee date with a friend that didn't exist. Then bigger lies, business meetings I had to attend, weekend errands that took longer than they should have. Each time I went to Liam. Each time I fell a little deeper, until the lines between right and wrong blurred into something I no longer cared to define. One evening, as I stood in front of the mirror adjusting my dress before heading out under the guise of a girls' night, David's voice startled me. "You've been going out a lot lately," he said casually, his eyes meeting mine in the reflection. My stomach twisted, but I forced a smile. "Just trying to keep busy," I replied, my voice too light, too practiced. He nodded, but something in his expression shifted, something that made my pulse stutter. I left the house with my heart pounding, a sick feeling curling in my gut. But the moment I stepped into the boutique and saw Liam's knowing smirk, the guilt evaporated. I was his now, whether I wanted to be or not. That night, as Liam's hands traced over my bare skin, as I lost myself in the heat of our affair, a thought crept into my mind, chilling me to the bone. This isn't just a game anymore. This is real. And sooner or later, someone is going to get hurt. But even then, even as the weight of my choices pressed down on me, I didn't stop. I couldn't. I had already gone too far to turn back. Liam's scent lingered on my skin long after I left the boutique that night. I drove home in silence, my hands tight around the steering wheel, my pulse still unsteady from the way his lips had claimed mine, from the way his fingers had traced my body with a possessiveness that left me breathless. The guilt should have hit me by now. I should have felt the weight of my betrayal pressing down on me, but all I felt was the echo of his touch, the way my body still ached for him, even as I pulled into the driveway. My hands trembled as I killed the engine, staring at the house I shared with David, the life I had built, the marriage I had sworn to protect. The house was dark except for the faint glow of the kitchen light. David was still at work, or maybe he had fallen asleep on the couch again, too exhausted to make it to bed. I let myself inside, slipping off my heels, my heart pounding as if I had been running. Every step I took felt heavier, like the walls themselves knew what I had done. I made my way to the bathroom, turning the water on full blast, letting the steam rise around me as I stripped out of my dress. The mirror was fogged over, obscuring my reflection. But I didn't need to see my face to know the truth. I wasn't the same woman who had walked into that boutique weeks ago. I had become someone else entirely. The water scalded my skin, but I didn't flinch. I stood beneath the stream, trying to wash away the heat of Liam's hands, the memory of his mouth, the way he made me feel alive in ways I hadn't in years. But no amount of scrubbing could erase the truth. I had crossed a line, and I wasn't even sure I wanted to go back. I closed my eyes, letting my head rest against the cool tiles, my breath coming in short, uneven bursts. What was I doing? How had I let it get this far? And why, despite everything, did I still want more? When I finally stepped out of the shower, David was in bed, his back to me, his breathing deep and steady. I watched him for a moment, waiting for something, guilt, regret, shame, but all I felt was distance. He was here, lying beside me, but he felt 1,000 miles away. I slipped beneath the covers, my body rigid, my mind restless. I thought of Liam, of the way he had whispered my name against my skin, of the fire that burned between us every time we touched. My fingers tightened around the sheets, my body betraying me all over again. The next morning, David kissed my forehead before leaving for work, his touch light, absent-minded. "I'll be home late," he said, already distracted by his phone. I nodded, watching him walk out the door, feeling the familiar ache of loneliness settle in my chest. And just like that, the guilt I had been expecting never came. If anything, his indifference only pushed me further into the arms of the man who actually saw me. The moment David was gone, I reached for my phone, my fingers hovering over Liam's number. I didn't even have to think about it. Liam answered on the first ring, his voice low, teasing. "Miss me already?" My lips curled into a smile, my body warming at the sound of his voice. "Maybe," I admitted, my heart racing. I could hear the smirk in his tone, the confidence in the way he responded. "Then come see me." It wasn't a question, and we both knew I wasn't going to say no. I walked into the Luxe boutique an hour later, my pulse hammering in anticipation. Liam was waiting for me, leaning against the counter like he had all the time in the world. His eyes darkened the moment he saw me, that knowing smirk pulling at his lips. You're becoming a habit," he murmured, reaching for my hand, his fingers sliding between mine. My breath caught, my body already reacting to his touch. "Maybe I like bad habits," I whispered, letting him pull me closer. This time, he didn't take me to the fitting room. He led me through a door at the back of the store into a private lounge area reserved for VIP clients. The room was dimly lit, luxurious, a space designed for indulgence. A plush leather couch sat against one wall, a sleek glass table in the center, a bottle of champagne chilling in a silver bucket as if he had been expecting me. My stomach tightened as Liam closed the door behind us, the click of the lock sending a shiver down my spine. He moved slowly, deliberately, his fingers brushing against my arm, my hip, my waist, setting my skin on fire. "You should tell me to stop," he murmured against my neck, his lips tracing a slow, torturous path along my jawline. I exhaled shakily, my hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer. "I don't want you to stop," I admitted, my voice claiming mine in a kiss that left me dizzy, weightless, completely undone. Hours passed, the world outside forgotten. By the time I left, my lips were swollen, my body thrumming with the aftermath of what we had done. Liam walked me to the door, his fingers grazing mine as he whispered, "Next time, stay longer." My heart pounded at the implication, at the certainty in his tone. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I was already slipping too deep into something I couldn't control. David barely acknowledged me when I got home, barely glanced up from his laptop as I walked through the door. "Good day?" he asked absently, his eyes still fixed on the screen. I swallowed the bitter laugh that threatened to rise, forcing a smile instead. "Yeah," I lied, my pulse still racing from Liam's touch. David nodded, already lost in work again, and I realized with a dull ache that he hadn't even noticed how different I was. The affair continued in secret, each meeting more reckless than the last. Liam and I couldn't get enough of each other, sneaking stolen moments whenever we could. The boutique became our sanctuary, our escape from reality, the only place where I truly felt alive. But the more I fell into him, the more dangerous it became. I started making mistakes, coming home too late, wearing perfume I never used around David, slipping up in ways that could no longer be ignored. One evening, as I sat across from David at the dinner table, I felt his gaze linger on me longer than usual. I forced myself to meet his eyes, my pulse quickening at the weight of his stare. "You've been different lately," he said, his voice careful, controlled. My heart lurched, panic creeping in. "Different how?" I asked, keeping my tone light, casual. He hesitated, studying me, and for the first time in a long time I felt like he was really looking at me. I don't know, just distant. I swallowed hard, my throat tightening. This was it, the moment where I could come clean, where I could tell him the truth, end this before it spiraled out of control. But then my phone buzzed in my lap and I didn't have to look to know who it was. Liam. My chest tightened, my hands gripping the edge of the table. "I've just been tired," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Nothing to worry about." David nodded slowly, but something in his expression told me he wasn't convinced. That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, knowing I was on borrowed time. The affair wasn't just a secret anymore. It was a ticking bomb. And sooner or later, it was going to explode. The affair felt unstoppable, like an avalanche gaining speed, consuming everything in its path. Every stolen moment with Liam deepened the addiction, his touch becoming the only thing that felt real. I told myself I had control, that I could manage the secrecy, but the truth was, I had already lost control long ago. The lies slipped off my tongue too easily now, each one weaving a tangled web I was no longer sure I could escape. I wasn't just cheating. I was living two lives, one where I played the devoted wife, and another where I surrendered completely to my own desires. David continued to watch me, suspicion creeping into his gaze, his questions becoming more frequent, more pointed. He never accused me outright, but I could feel it in the way his eyes lingered, in the way he reached for me at night, as if trying to hold on to something slipping through his fingers. I played my part well, feigning exhaustion, burying myself in meaningless distractions, but I could feel the noose tightening. The more I tried to act normal, the more unnatural it became. Guilt flickered at the edges of my mind, but it wasn't enough to make me stop. One evening, as I stepped out of the shower, I caught my reflection in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back at me. My lips were fuller, swollen from Liam's kisses, my skin glowing from the touch of a man who wasn't my husband. I ran a trembling hand down my neck, my breath shaky, knowing that if David really looked at me, he would see it too. I turned away, wrapping myself in a towel, shoving the truth into the same dark corner where I had hidden everything else. The next day, I met Liam in a hotel instead of the boutique. It was different there, more intimate, more dangerous. There were no hurried encounters, no risk of being interrupted. Just hours alone, wrapped up in him in the way he made me feel. His hands traced lazy patterns across my bare skin, his lips murmuring against my ear. Stay longer. I wanted to, God, I wanted to. But for the first time, a flicker of reality broke through the haze. I can't, I whispered, but even as I said it, I knew I would be back. David was waiting for me when I got home, standing in the dimly lit kitchen, his arms crossed over his chest. My stomach twisted at the sight of him, at the way he studied me with something unreadable in his eyes. Where were you? His voice was calm, too calm, the kind of calm that made my pulse race. I hesitated for half a second too long, searching for an excuse, but it was already too late. Out with a friend? I lied, forcing a smile. His silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. He finally nodded, but the tension didn't leave his shoulders. You've been different, he said, his voice quieter now, laced with something close to sadness. I don't know, Elena. I feel like I'm losing you. My heart clenched, guilt slamming into me like a tidal wave, but the words I should have said wouldn't come. Instead, I reached for him, pressing a kiss to his cheek, murmuring, I'm just tired. He didn't push, didn't argue, but as I walked past him, I could feel his doubt settling into the space between us. Days passed, and the weight of my deception grew heavier. Liam was relentless, sending texts, calling, always pulling me back in. I told myself this would be the last time, but I had said that before, and I knew it was a lie even as I stood outside the hotel door once more. The second he opened it, all my hesitation melted away, my body already aching for him. He kissed me before I could speak, his hands tangling in my hair, his body pressing me against the wall, making me forget everything except the way he made me feel. But the illusion shattered when my phone buzzed, breaking the moment, pulling me back into reality. I reached for it, my hands shaking as I saw David's name on the screen. I hesitated, my heart pounding, torn between the two men who had unknowingly become my entire world. Liam watched me, his expression unreadable as I silenced the call, shoving the phone back into my bag. You should answer that, he said, his voice laced with something I couldn't quite name. Not now, I whispered, but the unease had already settled in. The guilt was suffocating when I got home. David was in the living room, his phone in his hand, his expression unreadable. You didn't answer, he said, his voice measured, careful. I forced a laugh, waving a hand dismissively. Oh, I was in the middle of something and didn't hear it. His gaze didn't waver, and for the first time I saw it. The suspicion, the quiet devastation, the realization he wasn't saying out loud. He knew, maybe he didn't have proof yet, but he knew. The days that followed were torture. David was colder, distant in a way that sent panic thrumming through my veins. He wasn't asking questions anymore, wasn't pushing, and somehow that was worse. He was watching, waiting, letting me think I was safe. Liam, on the other hand, was growing bolder. He sent messages at all hours, hints of frustration creeping into his words when I didn't answer fast enough. "You're pulling away," he said one night, his voice thick with something close to anger. "I can feel it." I didn't know how to explain that I wasn't just pulling away. I was running out of places to hide. And then the bomb dropped. I came home late one night to find David sitting at the dining table, his laptop open, his fingers tapping against the wood in slow, deliberate beats. He looked up when I walked in, his eyes dark, unreadable. "Sit," he said, his voice a quiet command. My stomach plummeted. I moved slowly, my heart pounding, my palms damp with sweat. "David, what's—" He turned the laptop toward me and my world came crashing down. The screen showed a series of pictures, me and Liam, outside the boutique, leaving the hotel. Hands touching, eyes locked, bodies too close. I couldn't breathe. The room tilted, my vision blurring as reality slammed into me like a freight train. David's voice was eerily calm, too controlled. "How long?" I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. He exhaled, shaking his head. "Don't lie to me, Elena. Not anymore." Tears burned my eyes as I tried to find the words, but there was nothing I could say to make this better. "I'm sorry," I whispered, but the words felt hollow, meaningless. David let out a bitter laugh, rubbing a hand over his face. "Sorry? You're sorry?" His voice cracked, raw with betrayal. "God, Elena, I trusted you." The weight of his pain crushed me, but I had no right to ask for forgiveness. The silence stretched, unbearable, before he finally spoke again. "I want a divorce." The words sliced through me, leaving me gasping, my world crumbling at my feet. I had known this moment was coming, but hearing it out loud made it real in a way I wasn't prepared for. "David, please." He stood abruptly, pushing the chair back with a scrape against the floor. "No. No more lies. No more pretending." His voice wavered, but his resolve was unshakable. I deserve better. And he was right. I left that night, packing a bag in a haze of disbelief, of regret, of devastation. Liam called, but I didn't answer. None of it mattered anymore. I had lost everything, not just my marriage, but the version of myself I had once been, the woman who had promised to love David forever. I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror of a cheap motel, seeing nothing but the wreckage of my own choices. The affair had been intoxicating, thrilling, consuming, but in the end, all it left me with was ruin. The next morning, I turned off my phone and walked away from everything. From Liam, from David, from the woman I no longer recognized. But no matter how far I ran, I knew the truth. Some betrayals can never be undone, and some mistakes once made follow you forever. I checked into a motel that night, the silence around me deafening, suffocating. The air was thick with the scent of stale cigarettes and cheap fabric softener, a far cry from the crisp linen sheets I had once shared with David. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my reflection in the dusty mirror, wondering how I had let everything spiral so far out of control. My phone buzzed beside me, lighting up the dim room with Liam's name, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. He was the last thing I needed right now, yet a part of me still ached for the sound of his voice, for the comfort he had once given me in the midst of my self-inflicted chaos. I let the call go to voicemail, my hands clenching the fabric of my jeans, my body still humming from the adrenaline of David's fury. I had thought I was prepared for the consequences, had told myself I could handle whatever came next, but nothing could have braced me for the way his voice had broken, the way his eyes had darkened with a pain I had never meant to inflict. The word clung to my skin, making me feel raw and exposed, the weight of it pressing into my chest like a physical thing. I had been a fool to believe I could get away with it, that I could slip between two lives without tearing them both apart. Now, all I had left was the wreckage. The next morning, I woke to another missed call from Liam, his messages growing more desperate. "Talk to me. Let me see you. Don't shut me out like this." I stared at the words on the screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, but I had nothing to say. What could I tell him? That everything had come crashing down? That I was alone now, left with nothing but the ruin of my own choices? Instead, I powered off my phone and shoved it into my bag, knowing that avoiding him wouldn't be enough to erase what we had done. I left the motel, walking aimlessly through the city, my feet carrying me nowhere in particular. The streets were alive with people, couples laughing, children tugging on their parents' hands, vendors calling out their morning specials. It felt surreal watching the world move forward when mine had come to a screeching halt. I thought about going home, but home wasn't mine anymore. David had made that clear, and even if I begged, even if I pleaded, there was no fixing what I had broken. By the time the sun began to set, I found myself outside the Luxe boutique, my stomach twisting at the sight of it. The place where it had all started, where I had let temptation sink its claws into me, where I had let Liam's hands redefine everything I thought I wanted. I had no reason to be here, no excuse to walk through those doors again. But before I could talk myself out of it, I pushed inside. The bell chimed overhead, and the moment Liam's eyes met mine from behind the counter, I knew I had made a mistake. He looked relieved at first, his body tensing like he had been holding his breath since the moment I disappeared. But then his expression shifted, his eyes scanning over me, taking in the exhaustion, the sadness, the way I had unraveled. "Jesus, Elena," he murmured, stepping out from behind the register, his voice gentler than I expected. "Where the hell have you been?" I swallowed hard, my throat tight, my hands twisting in front of me as I searched for an answer I didn't have. "It's over," I finally whispered, the words falling from my lips before I could stop them. Liam's face hardened instantly, his jaw clenching, his hands flexing at his sides. "What do you mean, over?" His voice was quieter now, laced with something I couldn't quite place. Anger, maybe, or fear? I shook my head, feeling the sting of tears burning behind my eyes. "David knows. He found out, Liam. He has pictures." The silence that followed was suffocating, pressing into every space between us. Liam exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair, his body vibrating with tension. "And what?" he finally asked, his voice eerily calm. "That's it? You just walk away?" I flinched at the way he said it, like I owed him something. Like I hadn't already lost everything in the wake of this disaster. "What else can I do?" I snapped, my voice cracking. "My marriage is over. I have nothing left. I can't—" My breath hitched, my chest heaving as I fought to keep myself together. Liam stepped closer, his fingers curling under my chin, tilting my face up to meet his. "You have me," he murmured, his voice softer now, coaxing. "You don't have to do this alone." The words should have been comforting, but they only made the panic rise higher. Because the truth was, Liam wasn't safe either. He had been my escape, my reckless indulgence, the wildfire that had consumed everything in its path. And now that the destruction was complete, all that remained was the aftermath. "I can't," I whispered again, stepping back, severing the connection between us. "I need to figure out who I am without all of this." Liam's expression darkened, his hands dropping to his sides. But he didn't try to stop me this time. He just nodded, his jaw tight, his eyes heavy with something close to understanding. I walked out of the boutique, the door clicking shut behind me, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. But that breath was shallow, unsteady, tinged with the sharp sting of regret. I didn't know where I was going, didn't know what came next. All I knew was that I couldn't keep running from the wreckage of my own making. I had to face it, had to sit in the consequences, had to learn how to exist in the ruins. Days passed, then weeks, and I stayed away. I found a small apartment on the other side of the city, nothing fancy, just enough to feel like I was starting over. The silence was unbearable at first, the loneliness creeping into every corner, but I forced myself to sit in it, to feel it, to let it settle into my bones. There were nights when I wanted to pick up the phone, to call Liam, to hear his voice just one more time, but I never did, and he never reached out again. One afternoon, I found myself driving past my old neighborhood, my heart lurching at the sight of the house I had once called home. David's car was in the driveway, and through the front window I could see him sitting at the dining table, a coffee mug in front of him, his gaze distant. For a moment I thought about stopping, about knocking on the door, about telling him I was sorry one last time. But what good would it do? I had already destroyed the foundation we had built, and no amount of apologies could change that. Instead, I drove away, watching the house fade into the distance in my rearview mirror. Some mistakes are permanent, some betrayals too deep to mend. I had learned that the hard way, and maybe one day I would forgive myself. But for now, all I could do was keep moving forward, one step at a time, carrying the weight of my choices with me wherever I went. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks blurred into months. Time moved forward even when I felt like I was standing still, trapped in the wreckage of my own making. My apartment was small, barely furnished, just a mattress on the floor and a few scattered belongings, but it was mine. The silence was deafening at first, the absence of David's steady presence pressing into me like a weight I couldn't shake. I thought about calling him 100 times, about asking if we could talk, if there was even the smallest chance of fixing what I had broken, but I never did. Liam stopped calling after the first few weeks, his messages dwindling into nothing before finally disappearing altogether. I told myself it was for the best, that letting go was the only way to start over, but I still checked my phone at night, half hoping to see his name. I had spent so much time wrapped up in him, drowning in his touch, that the thought of never seeing him again felt like losing another part of myself. But the truth was, I had already lost too much. I had lost my home, my marriage, my identity as the woman I had been before this affair consumed me. Work became my only distraction, the one thing that gave me structure when everything else felt unstable. I threw myself into long hours, taking on extra shifts, burying my exhaustion beneath spreadsheets and endless emails. My coworkers noticed the change, the way I avoided small talk, the way I stayed late even when there was nothing left to do. "You okay?" one of them asked one evening as I packed up my things, her voice hesitant. I forced a smile, nodding too quickly. "Yeah, just keeping busy." The lie rolled off my tongue so easily now, I barely noticed it anymore. Nights were the worst. The loneliness crept in when the world went quiet, when there was no one left to distract me from my own thoughts. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the past in my mind like an old film I couldn't turn off. I thought about David, about the way he had looked at me that night, the way his voice had cracked when he told me he wanted a divorce. I thought about Liam, about the way he had held me in the dark, whispering promises that had never been meant to last. And I thought about myself, about the woman I had become, the choices I had made, the damage I had done. One afternoon I saw David. It was unintentional. I had stopped at a cafe on my lunch break, needing caffeine to power through another exhausting day, and when I turned around, he was there. He looked different. Thinner, maybe, his face a little more lined, but his presence still made my breath hitch. He hadn't seen me yet, and for a split second, I considered slipping out before he did, but something in me hesitated, rooted me to the spot, made me wonder if maybe this was a chance for something, anything, even if it was just closure. Our eyes met across the room and I saw the flicker of recognition, the way his posture stiffened, his lips pressing into a thin line. He hesitated, then walked toward me, his steps careful, measured, like he wasn't sure what to expect. "Elena," he said, his voice quieter than I remembered, and God, hearing him say my name again after all this time nearly broke me. I swallowed hard, gripping my coffee cup like it was the only thing keeping me upright. "Hi, David." It felt ridiculous, this simple exchange after everything we had been through, but it was all I could manage. There was a moment of silence, thick and awkward, before he finally exhaled and rubbed the back of his neck. "You look good?" It wasn't a compliment, just an observation, but I still felt it settle into my skin like a warmth I didn't deserve. "Thanks," I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. "So do you." He nodded, his gaze flickering down to his watch, like he was already calculating how quickly he could leave. "How have you been?" I asked, hating how small my voice sounded, how desperate I was for even a shred of familiarity between us. He shrugged, looking past me, out the window. "Busy. Work's been..." He trailed off, then sighed. "It's been a lot." I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Work was what you threw yourself into when everything else fell apart, when you needed something, anything, to keep from feeling the full weight of loss. "I'm sorry," I said, not even sure what I was apologizing for anymore. Was it for running into him? For ruining our marriage? For being here at all? His jaw tensed, his eyes darkening in a way that told me he still carried the weight of what I had done. "Are you?" The words were sharp, cutting through me like a blade. I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening around my coffee cup. Yes. It was the truth, the only truth I had left. I had been sorry for months, for everything, for the choices I had made, for the way I had hurt him, for the fact that no amount of regret would ever change what I had done. David studied me for a long moment, then let out a slow breath, his shoulders dropping slightly. "I have to go," he said, and just like that, the moment was over. I nodded, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Yeah, of course." He hesitated, as if he wanted to say something else, but instead, he just gave me one last unreadable look before turning and walking out the door. I watched him leave, my heart twisting, knowing that whatever we had once been was well and truly gone. The encounter left me shaken, more than I had expected. Seeing David again had been like reopening a wound I had thought was healing, only to realize it was still raw beneath the surface. I spent the rest of the day lost in thought, my mind cycling through every moment of our conversation, analyzing every word, every glance, every breath. I had wanted closure, but now I wasn't sure if I had gotten it or if I had only made things worse. That night, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called Liam. The phone rang twice before he picked up, his voice instantly alert, like he had been waiting for this. "Elena?" I closed my eyes, swallowing past the lump in my throat. "I saw David today," I said, skipping past the small talk, past the pleasantries. It was harder than I thought it would be. There was a pause, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer, careful. "Do you want to talk about it?" I hesitated, unsure of what I wanted. Liam had been my escape, the fire I had thrown myself into when my life had felt empty. But now, after everything, I wasn't sure if I was running to him or running away from something else. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know who I am without all of this." The silence stretched between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was just there, a shared understanding. A moment of truth between two people who had set fire to everything and were still standing in the ashes. Liam sighed. I could almost hear the smile in his voice when he finally spoke. "Then maybe it's time to find out." The words settled into me. Not an answer, but maybe the beginning of one. I didn't know what came next. I didn't know if I would ever truly move on from the choices I had made, from the people I had hurt, from the woman I had become. But as I sat there, staring out the window at the city lights, I realized something. I was still here. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. I sat in my apartment long after my call with Liam, staring at the blank wall as if the answer to my unraveling was hidden somewhere within the cracks. His words echoed in my mind, the weight of them settling deep in my chest. Then maybe it's time to find out. The problem was, I didn't know where to start. For so long, I had defined myself by what I had done, by the mistakes, by the betrayal, by the tangled web of lies that had torn my marriage apart. But now, standing in the wreckage of it all, I realized I had no idea who I was without the destruction. The next morning, I woke with a heaviness I couldn't shake. I moved through the motions, showering, dressing, making coffee, but none of it felt real. It was like I was watching someone else live my life, someone detached from the choices that had led her here. I scrolled through my phone, my fingers hovering over Liam's number, but I didn't call him again. Something had shifted in me. I didn't know if I needed him or if I just needed something familiar to hold on to. Either way, I wasn't ready to find out. Work became my safe space, the only place where I didn't feel like I was drowning. I took on extra projects, stayed late, let the hum of productivity drown out the silence waiting for me at home. But even that wasn't enough. No matter how much I buried myself in deadlines and meetings, the past still clung to me, an invisible chain wrapped tight around my throat. It was in the way my coworkers looked at me, like they sensed something was off, but didn't know how to ask. It was in the way I avoided mirrors, afraid of seeing the truth staring back at me. One evening, as I was packing up my things, I heard someone clear their throat behind me. I turned to find Rachel, one of the women I worked with, standing in the doorway, arms crossed. "You ever take a break?" she asked, her tone light but laced with curiosity. I forced a smile, shrugging. "Keeps me busy." She tilted her head, studying me for a moment before nodding. "Drinks. Tomorrow night. No excuses." I almost declined, the words forming on my lips, but then I stopped myself. Maybe I needed this. Maybe I needed something that wasn't tied to my past. The bar was loud, filled with laughter and clinking glasses, the kind of noise that made it easy to forget things. Rachel and a few others from work had gathered around a small table, already a few drinks in when I arrived. "She made it," Rachel cheered, sliding a cocktail in my direction. I laughed, shaking my head but taking a sip anyway. It was strange, sitting here among people who didn't know the full story, who didn't look at me like I was broken. For the first time in a long time, I felt something close to normal. Halfway through the night, Rachel leaned in, her voice just low enough for only me to hear. "So, what's your deal?" I blinked, caught off guard. "My deal?" She smirked, swirling the ice in her glass. "You're always working, always distracted, like you're running from something." My stomach twisted, the easy warmth of the evening suddenly feeling a little too sharp. "Just trying to figure things out," I said finally, my fingers tightening around my drink. She nodded, her gaze knowing. "Yeah, me too." The night ended with a round of goodbyes, laughter lingering in the air as we all went our separate ways. As I walked back to my apartment, I realized how long it had been since I had allowed myself to just exist without the weight of guilt crushing me. It wasn't a solution, wasn't some grand revelation, but it was something, a step. And right now, that had to be enough. A week later, I ran into David again. This time, it wasn't by accident. I had been walking through the park, trying to clear my head, when I saw him sitting on a bench, his eyes distant as he watched the world move around him. My feet hesitated, my heart hammering against my ribs, but before I could talk myself out of it, I found myself walking toward him. "Hey," I said softly, my voice unsure. He turned, his expression unreadable as his gaze met mine. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us, thick with everything we had left unsaid. Finally, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I thought you left." I swallowed, shaking my head. "I did, but I guess I'm still trying to figure out where to go." He nodded slowly, as if he understood. "Yeah, me too." We sat there for a while, neither of us pushing, neither of us trying to fix what couldn't be fixed. It wasn't an apology, wasn't a plea for forgiveness, just two people sharing a moment of quiet understanding. Eventually, David stood, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Take care of yourself, Elena." My throat tightened, but I managed a small nod. "You too." And then he was gone, disappearing into the crowd, leaving me sitting there with nothing but the ghost of what we had once been. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts tangled in everything that had led me here. I thought about Liam, about the way he had made me feel alive, reckless, wanted. I thought about David, about the life we had built and destroyed, and I thought about myself, about the pieces of me that I was still trying to gather. Maybe I would never fully understand why I had done what I did. Maybe I would always carry the weight of it. But for the first time in months, I realized something. I wasn't the same woman who had walked into that boutique all those months ago. I wasn't the wife who had craved something she couldn't name, nor was I the woman who had burned her life down for a fleeting thrill. I was something in between, something still unfinished, still searching. And maybe that was okay. Maybe the only way forward was to accept that some scars never fade, that some mistakes never fully release their hold. The next morning, I woke up and did something different. I didn't reach for my phone to check for messages from Liam. I didn't let the past dictate how I moved through the day. I made coffee, I opened the window to let in the fresh air, and I allowed myself to simply be. It wasn't closure, wasn't a grand epiphany, but it was enough, a beginning, and for now, that was all I could ask for.